Hello and welcome to the winter webinar series. So this is going to be our first webinar to this webinar series, talking about adventurers and globetrotters and people pushing the boundaries for blind and low vision people. So it should be a very exciting series. I'm glad that you're all joining us. While I've got you, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the many lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So, our guest at this time is an adventurer, a writer, a speaker, and content creator with a passion and a curiosity for discovering the unknown and pushing the boundaries. This has taken him to numerous exotic, exciting places around the world, and he now captivates audiences with his tales of travel and adventure. Joining us from South Africa, I believe it's just turned 6 a.m. in the morning there. Christopher Venter, thank you so much for joining us today.
Morning, Jordan. Good morning, everyone.
So this is not usually the traditional question I would start a webinar with, but I believe it's quite relevant for our chosen topic and our audience. Can you describe your sight loss journey for us?
Sure. So 10 years and a month ago, I could see. And I just finished a long career working as a professional chef, which I found quite exhilarating because I made it adventurous by working in remote destinations. And my career took me all around the world. I worked in far-flung places like St. Helena Island in the South Atlantic Ocean, the Falklands, Ascension, Jamaica, Cuba, Croatia, the Cayman Islands, Belize, all of that type of thing. So I'd go and develop kitchens in remote spots for military operations, for new hotels, train their staff and do all of that type of thing. So I had adventures as a sight person, but I was tired of sweating and swearing behind the grill and decided I need to write a book because that's an ambition I'd always had. And not being creative enough to just thumbsuck the book, I decided to rather go and live an adventure which would give me something to write about. And my adventure was to ride on a little 150cc two-stroke Vespa scooter all the way from Cape Town, South Africa, where I was living at the moment, to Dublin Island, through Africa and across Europe. It was a 30,000-kilometer journey over 8 months, touching 20 countries with no support vehicle on this tiny little scooter. And I used the publicity stunt as a fundraiser for the Red Cross Children's Hospital, which is here in Cape Town. We raised a bucket load of money for them. We had a great adventure, and my story became a much bigger story when I contracted a virus while crossing Africa, which ultimately would later lead to my sight loss a few months after the trip. And yeah, that was 2013 was my trip. In 2014, I one day could see and the next day couldn't.
So it pretty much happened overnight, which is quite unusual in the blind community. Have you ever had you ever met a blind person before, or did you have anyone to sort of as a sounding board as this was happening?
Yeah, so after the journey, it was a few months after the journey. I got ill during the journey. I actually had to fly home for medical help, and then I was pumped full of vitamins, antibiotics, and told to go and complete the trip, which I did. I then got home quite ill because obviously they weren't diagnosing correctly. They were just boosting my system. And so, yes, it did happen overnight, the sight loss, but I was quite ill at that point. I couldn't walk anymore. I'd lost 80% of my body weight. And yeah, I was pretty broken. And I'd gone through a medical trauma of lumbar punctures, chest x-rays, MRIs, scans, you name it. So many blood tests, my arms looked like train tracks. Then I suddenly lost my sight and was sent to an ophthalmologist because the doctors had looked into my eyes, but they hadn't obviously diagnosed the virus attacking the retinas at the back of my eyes, because most doctors are not going to look through your eyes. Yeah. And the ophthalmologist sent me for a different set of tests, and of course immediately diagnosed correctly, saved my life, but could do nothing about my sight loss. And at that point, I'd never met another blind person. I'd seen blind people. I'd never had a conversation with one. I'd never met one. I knew nothing. I was as oblivious as most sighted people unfortunately are, and thought that if you're blind, it means you must be a little deaf as well. You must be totally incapacitated, not capable of living a full life. And yeah, for a long time, I did feel that way. In fact, the first blind person that I met, I had a chat with him on the phone a few months after going blind. And my question to him was, do you have a blind dog? And his
Yeah.
response was, well, I hope he's not blind, otherwise we're both stuffed.
Um, so this this would have been extremely, extremely confronting. Did you have what sort of supports were available in South Africa for someone in your position?
Unfortunately, very little. I always say if you're blind from birth or blind as a child and you attend a school for blind, you're at least around other visually impaired people and you have the opportunity to grow within that world. It's what you know. But if you're an adult, I was 40 years old, very suddenly, sight loss. I reached out to a couple of the sight loss support services, that government sight loss support services here, and really hit a wall. I couldn't even get a cane. I used a piece of electrical conduit pipe for a while. There was no mobility instruction. There was no um, training on software. When I tried to figure things out, luckily I had YouTube and tech, and that allowed me to just self-teach and
Yeah.
pretty much get up to the point where I was mobile again. Luckily for me, well, not luckily, but I was quite ill as well. It took me a few months to be able to walk again, to be able to go to the toilet unassisted and things like that. So I had a lot of time to sit and figure stuff out. And that might have been a good thing, because to be honest, if it was not for the fact that I couldn't walk, I probably would have walked out in front of a truck or done something stupid like that.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Um, let's talk a little bit about your supports during this time. Would it be fair to say that you and your partner had a relationship based on you being sighted, I would imagine? How were you able to pivot with the change, and what sort of methods did you utilize for that?
Yeah, so my partner at the time was a girlfriend that I had met 2 or 3 years before. In fact, today is our 14-year anniversary.
Well,
So
congratulations.
exactly 4 years before going blind. And when I met her, I said to her, look, Tamlin, I have this idea to ride a little Vespa scooter as a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital and create a story. I'm tired of being in a kitchen and fighting with stuff and struggling and working remotely and traveling. I want to I want to write a story about travel and adventure, but I have to go and live it first. And I need you to understand, if you're entering into this relationship with me, there is a chance that I might die. And that's a big thing. So you need to be prepared to
And your
know that I'm
concern
going to be gone for
obviously
the ball.
associated
I,
with
I've
obviously
got
being a little Vespa scooter and driving through some very challenging terrain, I imagine.
Africa, challenging terrain, challenging environment, challenging countries, border crossings, political unrest in the Middle East. There were so many things that were had potential to cost me my life. And I was prepared to risk it to have this mammoth epic adventure to give me the most amazing story. Of course, the story ended up becoming so much bigger when I did become ill and lost my sight. But my partner at the time, who was my girlfriend, decided, no, absolutely, she's quite adventurous. She rock climber, she does all sorts of things like that. So she said, of course, go and have your adventure. Thinking I might actually never have the adventure, because it was a dream at that time. But went, had the adventure, ended up losing my sight. But when I came home, it was at a point where I'd just had a whole lot of medication and I was okay. We went and we got engaged. My intention was to get engaged to her in Dublin at the end of my trip. And she was going to fly over. But with me having to fly home halfway through the trip and all the medical stuff, and that, it put such a financial strain on us that she wasn't able to fly to Dublin. So
Yeah.
the ring actually traveled with me all the way to Dublin and traveled back to South Africa with me. And then a couple of months after, we went and found a nice quiet spot on the beach, not far from where we live at the moment. And I proposed. And then a few months later, I went blind.
Yeah.
And I said to her, Tamlin, I'm going to give you an out. This is not the life that you signed up for. Please go. Let me deal with this. You go and have a life. And she said, I kind of made up my mind that I wouldn't accept limiting her in life, because she hadn't signed up for that. She hadn't chosen that. It was my problem, not hers.
Yeah.
And she said, Chris, what would you have done? If this was me lying in the bed, would you have walked out? And I know I wouldn't. And that kind of made it okay. And she's been the strength has made me as strong as I am.
Yeah, definitely. What sort of other strengths do you reckon helped you through this particular point in time?
I remember at school getting a certificate for perseverance, and my folks having it up with me saying, "Gee, that's because you're a little stubborn bastard." I, I guess I'm determined to the point that I will not let any challenge stop me. And um, luckily, I've found a way. I had a beautiful young partner. I had my whole life ahead of me, and I just had to find a way to turn that stumbling block into a stepping stone, and luckily, I've managed to.
Yeah, definitely. So that bringing that on to a little bit more sort of present day. Um,
Mm.
Obviously you obviously established some guidelines with your partner. Did you find it tough to reestablish your identity in the household, living with sight loss as a husband, provider, father now, or father not now, but father as well?
Father to be, yeah. Look, it was really difficult. I knew the house well. I navigated around it. I think if I'd had a little bit of support, it would have made things easier. So it was challenging to get out the house. Within the house, I settled in and I started realizing that, um, for example, in the kitchen when I used to chop an onion, 9 times out of 10, I was busy dealing with stuff and all of that anyway. So I
Yeah.
realized, well, I wasn't really looking at what I was doing. I can't do it. So I started fiddling and wasn't long, and I'd taken on the cooking role again. And yeah, I guess that restriction of that environment might have helped me in a way because it gave me a point that I could be safety within.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I've always embraced tech and managed to adapt to it quickly. So I had to learn quickly how to use an iPhone, how to use a MacBook, an iPad, and all of that type of thing. And and just as well, I do, because even today, if you go into the iStore here in South Africa and you tell them that you need to learn how to use VoiceOver, they're probably going to give you my number because there isn't. There is just no resource. No one
Yeah.
teaches it. No one shows you use it. Um, I know that the South African Guide Dogs Association have a new mobility wing now, so they have an O&M that'll teach you how to use a cane and things like that. But that is a more recent development that wasn't in place years ago. Um, yeah, so my support came from my partner, yes, and also my environment as well as my stubborn, perseverant nature, I guess.
Yeah. So going on to that, obviously I've gone and experienced this project that you've been doing recently, about you building a house for your family blind. Uh, Most people would find this transition fascinating, I believe. Um, so you've gone from reestablishing your identity in the household to pushing that identity as a provider, and building a house blind and doing it with very uh, can-do attitude, I would say. Can you tell us a little bit about this project, how it came about, and a little bit more about, yeah, how you navigated through this?
Yeah, so basically, I'm an adventurer who went blind. I decided to be an adventurer before going blind, not a blind person who decided to become an adventurer. So I knew that I had to have adventures, and I'd been having all these extreme things where I'm throwing myself off a mountain or paddling in the ocean, doing all sorts of things, which we can talk about in a minute, I'm sure. But that led me to the point where um, COVID came, and it restricted me with international travel. So although I had these ambitions to do things abroad, I ended up having to revisit that thinking and undertook in 2020 a massive project that was local based. And I'm glad that I did that because it got me to see some beautiful areas within my own region that I hadn't seen, fall in love with one of those areas. And as an adventurer, you need to fund those adventures. So you fund them through speaking and through writing. So I'd written a couple of books already, and I had then come to realize it's not about being a writer, a speaker. It's actually you need to create content. So I'm a content creator, and that gives me something to write about, something to speak about, and that funds adventures for me. So you have to find different ways of doing things. You are not able to just go to a company and say, well, give me this, because then it's a donation. So by building a house, I could barter with them. I could say, right, we have a production company involved in this project. We have um, a contract with the local satellite channel, and we will be giving you guys exposure in exchange for product. And it allowed me to build a house for about half of what it would have cost me normally, which still meant that I had to spend a fortune because we built this massive villa, a beautiful, beautiful home. And as a blind person, that project was something that I, without a doubt, called the most challenging thing I've ever done in my life, because I had no idea. I'd had little tweaks and little, almost bushes of being a builder, so I had a little bit of an insight into what it's like, but I'd never really delved into the industry to the extent that I would have to, and I didn't realize that I would have to such an extent. But from marking the ground, from clearing the ground, from designing the house, right up to yesterday, we finished building the swimming pool. So, although the project is over, it was over a year ago, we're still doing little things. We're still tweaking. And I have an exchange student coming to stay with us next week. So we had to finish the garden outside the room that she's in. Although the front of the house might look perfect, and that back corner of the garden hadn't been done yet. So a building project is something that is, well, it drags out, and it takes everything, because you can't step away from it. If you're going to go and cycle, you're going to do a cycle race, you get on the bike, you ride the race, you do a bit of training before, and it's done. This uh, this has been tough. This has been really tough. Would you like me to tell you how I designed the house? Because that's quite interesting.
Well, I was going to say, I've obviously watched some of the videos of you doing little things, and I think what stood out is just the difference in the two countries that you had to sort of innovate so much. Tell us a little bit about how you mapped out your rooms, for example.
So I went into a hardware store with intentions of buying a um, piece of pegboard that I could peg things into. And we ended up settling on one of those boards that they kind of hang their product from. So it's a masonite piece of sheet that's got holes in it drilled equally about an inch apart. We work in centimeters, but they were an inch apart. And then I found some little bolts that can just screw it into those holes and bit. And then I ran those for each corner of the room, and I ran elastic bands around to make a floor plan. And funnily enough, I'd organized an event of speakers about a year before this, and I had to do a floor plan for the tables, and I'd used a similar system. So it allowed me to design the house and then take it to an architect, have him draw it, which then, once printed, we took the pinned up plan, we put it on a pegboard and put little safety pins in that protrude, and did the same thing with elastic, so I'd have a more accurate rendition of what it looked like, and ultimately work towards having a 3D model of the house. And yeah, a few iterations of that later, we had a house designed for a blind man by a blind man.
Yeah, yeah. Look, I'll obviously share with our listeners today some information on how to access that content.
Sure.
I thought what was interesting as well is that it was really truthfully told, in the sense of you obviously pointed out your neighbor, for example, changed the fence line, thinking you wouldn't notice, and that you so you had your challenges to deal with that, and lots of other sort of builders potentially would look at a blind person and think that this is this is something that they can take advantage of. Is that the experience that
Say
you
it as it is, Jordan. Say it as it is. Take advantage of a blind man.
had?
I
So,
didn't allow that to happen. I had to be quite OCD about everything, every measurement I had to check. And the reality is, there are tricks, there are ways that you can check things. And for me as a blind person, it's either right or wrong. There's no give or take. It either is that measurement or it isn't that measurement. Little things I had to innovate. For example, the system we built with, there was no way of securing the windows, so I had to design a little like a jig that allowed the windows to be attached. Unfortunately, there were still mistakes, and there are still things that I'm fixing day by day, mostly born from an incompetent architect who just designed badly, did silly things. But Yeah, luckily I like innovating and doing crazy things, doing unique and yeah, alternative ways of fixing. So we've had a bit of that. It's made me stronger.
Do you feel like the project also educated a little bit about, or educated the wider
Hugely,
community helping you as well?
hugely. I've had so many people contact me now saying, I had no idea. You know, my advice, the favorite question people ask me is, should I build with the same system or should I build or what, or should I? And I always say, don't even build because it's really hard. It's expensive. That's what people don't realize. It's expensive not only financially, but it's expensive on your life, on your family, on your mind, on your body. It is draining. It's absolutely draining. I perhaps bit off a little bit more than I could chew here, but that's my style. That's kind of what I've always done. So at the end of the day, I've got a very, very beautiful house, a house that I would never have been able to afford in any other way. And the way I look at it is that for the year that I was building, or the year and a half almost that I was building, the money saved on the project was a salary for me.
Yeah.
And I assure you, there was no donation. There was no like, here's a product, take it, because it's a two-way street. People make a mistake with sponsorship. They always think, oh well, I can get some shoes to go and run a marathon. It's a two-way street. It's an agreement. It's a partnership. So those companies need to get the same amount of exposure and more. Otherwise, they're not going to sponsor you again.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Well said. And going on to that, we're moving on to yourself as an adventurer. As this is what this webinar series is all about, blind and low vision people exploring the
So,
uncharted. You identified as an adventurer prior to your sight loss, as you've said. What were the
mm.
notable differences adventuring as a blind person for you?
I was very concerned at first. You know, it's obviously little baby steps going out the front door and taking the first couple of steps until you get to the corner and then coming back and forth, back and forth. But I realized that you can still do things and you just have a different way of seeing things. So my first very big adventure was in 2019, 2018, 2018, 2019. And that was obviously when you go blind, you start looking at resources and you start reading things. So I read a book by Jason Roberts called The Sense of the World. It's a story of James Holman, who is, you know, arguably the most famous blind person other than Helen Keller, who was a traveler in the late 19th century, and he lost his sight and he went and he had this moment where he actually went and trained to be a doctor, and the doctor said to him, "This is," with hopes that he would find a cure. And when he realized it wouldn't, they said, "Well, why don't you go and seek out some warmer climates?" And rather than go and have a holiday, he took it to mean, well, maybe that'll help my sight loss if I go and explore. But his first project took him, he was from Exeter in the UK, but it took him between France and southern Italy. And I went and did a modern day look at that. So my project was to take a walk in his footsteps. I did it in reverse and do some of the challenges that he did along the way to see how they were today versus back then. And my partner, Tamlin, who was my wife by then, went along with me, but she literally didn't even know where we were going. She had no idea. I planned the entire trip. She didn't know what we're doing every day. She was there to drive the camera and keep me warm at night. That's what I always jokingly say. So where Holman had the advantages of hearing a horse cart coming down the road from miles away, and people walking with these hard-soled shoes on cobbled streets, I almost got run over by an electric car. So he did have some advantages over me. But then, of
Mhm.
course, I had Airbnb, where he could have knocked on a door at night and probably been invited in for a meal and given a place to sleep. Um, I had the advantage of tech. I could use Uber, whereas he'd have to hail one of those horse carts. He did things like he climbed Mount Vesuvius, and funnily enough, he climbed it while it was erupting. Now, Mount Vesuvius is no longer open to climbing, so I climbed Mount Etna, which is in Sicily, which is a bigger volcano, and we climbed it while it was erupting and the snow was falling around us.
Wow.
And yeah, I tried to get a sense of what he felt, and that was the story for my second book. I want to tell you something that I forgot to mention in the previous question there. When I first went blind, I had a collection of vintage Vespa scooters. That's why the Vespa scooter was the means of mobility for my journey. And I'd always been known as Chris the scooter guy, because Chris is a common name. So you'd phone someone and say, "Hey, it's Chris," and they'd say, "Which Chris?" And you said, "Chris the scooter guy." "Oh, Chris the scooter guy, got it." And then all of a sudden, people started referring to me as Chris the blind guy. And that
Yeah.
didn't really fit for me. And then Tamlin said to me one day, she said, but you are Chris the blind guy, but you're Chris the blind scooter guy. So that's why the title of my first book is How I Became the Blind Scooter Guy, which has kind of become my little gimmick now, the blind scooter guy. And this adventure saw me well, traveling around Europe, doing all these things, kayaking the Amalfi Coast on the Tyrrhenian Sea, where he'd gone on a fishing rowboat, hiking in the Grand Forest in Tuscany, which he'd done, and he also happened to get lost, as did we. So, looking back, I guess, I was concerned about going to places that I'd been before because I didn't want to ruin them. I didn't
Yeah.
want the memory to be punished because now I couldn't see them. And what I realized is that using my four remaining senses, I can see things very differently and sometimes a lot clearer than what I could as a sight person. For example, if you take Sicily, the two main towns are Catania and Palermo. So Catania is in the shadow of Mount Etna, the volcanic mountain. So everything is built with volcanic rock. So the cobbles in the street are much rougher. If you brush against the building, it's a much more textured feel. The accents are a little different. They pronounce, the one calls the risotto rice balls arancini, the one calls it arancina. The sense that you pick up from the food is a little bit different because the one is a lot more Arabically influenced. So there's different sets of spices there to what you'd have, in Palermo and Catania. The church bells chime totally differently. For me, a church bell just chimed, and that was it. But now I realize that every single one has got its own call, just like a lighthouse has its own signal.
Yeah.
So I realized that I could see things more clearly as the blind adventurer than I could as the blind scooter guy, who was, or I could see things more clearly as the blind adventurer, blind scooter guy than I could as the sighted one.
Yeah.
Just in a different way.
So we're gonna
I know there was a roundabout way of getting at that.
So look, we're going to get a little bit more in depth with that, but we're at the midway point of the webinar. So I'll just remind people that the chat function is open on this webinar. If you do want to ask our guest a question, the keystroke is Alt-H to bring up the chat window, then type your question in for us and I will direct it towards Chris. So I'm also mindful too, Chris, that you've answered quite a few of my questions I had sitting there just in one sentence. So I will I will push on though and ask the question. So I wrote a bit of a question here and I pitched it to you once in a conversation. And I'm quoting Tolkien, who was a famous fantasy writer, wrote The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. So he once wrote, "It's dangerous business going out your door. You step onto the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you might be swept off to." What was your thought process the first time you left on a blind adventure?
Yeah. So again, that brings me to the point that I kind of like stole a little bit earlier there, seeing your question. I didn't realize how clearly I'd see things as a blind person and how much I would appreciate them in a different way. And it was a fearful thing for me to think that those memories were going to be tarnished, they were going to be ruined. But
Yeah.
I also realized that I always use this analogy when I do presentations. I found myself on a road that was rough, rugged, ripped up, littered with debris and potholes. This horrible road where there was just no clear way forward or backwards because the road behind me had collapsed. It was gone. It disappeared into an oblivion. And far to my right, I could see the road of technology, this beautiful highway that was smoothly tarred. And far to the left was another road, and there was the road of medical innovation, stem cells and things like that. That was also this beautiful path that I'd much rather be on. But unfortunately, there was no way for me to get from the road that I was on onto either of those two roads. So the only thing I could do is put one foot in front of the other and move through that rubble, through that debris, to a point where the road is smoother. And at this point, there is still no clear way over to either of those roads. And perhaps one day there will be, perhaps one day there won't be. But the road, by moving through that bad part, by moving rather than just standing there, I avoided getting run over, and the road has become a lot smoother.
Yeah.
So you can't just stand still.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
can't. You've got to take a step, because what is the other option? So yes, to go back to your Tolkien quotes, what is the other option? To not move, to not venture, to stay still.
Yeah.
For me, that's more damaging, or more of a torture.
Your first adventure, it wasn't to somewhere that you were familiar with because you're obviously afraid of tarnishing prior memories that you might have had as a sighted person experiencing that. Did you go safe? You strike me as somebody that would be strategic in picking a destination, or did you just kind of go where the wind blew you?
Yeah, I started doing little things, so little samplers, little tasters. I love writing. I love telling stories. So I got into almost having a look at different things from an adventurous point of view as a blind person, and writing articles for different companies. So I went on the Rover Trail, which was um, it's the world's most luxury vintage rebuilt steam train that runs here in Africa. And I went and did a couple of days on that, wrote an article for them, and started realizing I can actually do a lot more than all these little bite-sized things.
Yeah.
And that's where we tackled the big cyclist from Sicily to southern France trip, which was also to create the story for my second book. And there were going to be a lot more of those, because that was a hugely successful trip. And the outcome of the very first trip was going blind. The outcome of the second big expedition was having a baby.
Yeah.
So it was very much yeah, this works. I can do it as a blind person. And being blind gets me into doors, gets me noticed, gets me the opportunity to do things that I wouldn't have perhaps been able to do as a sighted person. So it's certainly something I wanted to, as I said, turn that stumbling block into a stepping stone. But then, of course, the great COVID came, and that threw everybody's life into a turmoil. And I realized that international travel has become inaccessible to me from a financial point of view, and just logistically, it was a bit of a nightmare for a while. But I don't want to stop. So in 2020, that's where I undertook what would become an even bigger adventure, which I did locally.
Yeah. So, uh, Chris, in regards to the roads that you were talking about with technology as well,
Yeah.
and bearing in mind, as I said, you've already kind of given us a bit of a background on some of the services that are available in your country of residence. Your book, is there plans or things in place to make that into an audio book? Do you know?
Yes, there is. We I want to read it myself, but the first book was a very, very big book. It's like a telephone book. And yeah, I've just been too busy to sit down with a studio and do that, because it's going to be a big, big, big job to do that. Or I have to bite the bullet and have someone else read it. There's actually talk about it being turned into a production.
Yeah, right. That's exciting.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. But it is available as an ebook as well. So it is accessible to everyone.
okay, so on the path of adventuring experiences, do you said that in your second book you were truly setting out as a baby, and you were saying that you maybe have still got a little bit of a way to go to get to where you want to go as well. Would you consider yourself an adult now with the traveling experience, or like has it changed you?
You have to learn very quickly when you're blind. You have to adapt without having the opportunity, because when you fall hard. And I've fallen many times, banged my head. Even right now as we speak, I've got a little scar on my forehead from a wall I connected the other day. There's yeah, it's a steep learning curve, but once you get over it, it does get easier. It gets a lot easier. And I look at my projects of my 2020 project, which we'll talk about in a minute, it was massive. It was a physical exertion, and I realized that in Europe, climbing Mount Etna and kayaking and things like that, I can actually do those physical things as well, without totally faltering. It is possible. You just have to be determined and stubborn enough to just keep trying. And then I realized also that not only as a blind person, but just as a person going and doing these things, you're able to inspire others who think it's not possible. So not only the disabled community, but just the community in general, who my biggest fear in life is getting old and sitting one day on my stoop talking about the things that I wish I had done instead of the things that I had done.
Yeah, yeah, I can understand that. And far as your experience, you touched on it as well, that there were some experiences that you may or may not have had the opportunity to do if you hadn't lost your sight. Do you feel like some of those experiences you may not have even tried to undertake as a sighted person? Has it sort of pushed you to try new things that you think are pushing limits?
Yeah, without a doubt. So firstly, with regard to the building project, I never ever would have been able to afford a house like this if I wasn't blind. There were a whole lot of people that had employment, a cameraman that followed me around. There were teams that did things that were beyond the normal build that wouldn't have had a job for that year if not for us doing this house. So this house and the project of building it certainly opened doors for both myself that they wouldn't have opened as a sights person, or possibly wouldn't have opened, as well as for other people. And as far as the adventures go, I mean, I hadn't ridden a bicycle since I was a child, maybe 10 years old, 12 years old. And I recently competed in the Cape Town Cycle Tour and we won our category on a tandem. So there are things I would never have done that if I hadn't gone blind. But I find myself as almost an accidental accessibility advocate. I never chose to do that. I'm just a guy who wants to go and have adventures and tell stories about them and live a fun life that I can be proud of one day. But I have to be something of a role model so that when another blind person is in the same situation as me, another newly blind person, they can see someone that is or has managed to turn this around and still live a full, fun, fruitful life. So rather than just do these things without purpose, the purpose has to be multifaceted. And that if that means pushing my limits beyond my comfort zone, um, to make the content more interesting, to make it more authentic, then so be it. I'm up for that challenge. Hey,
Yeah,
I didn't go and acrolites around the world or like Miles or sail a boat to Australia like his brother. They're the legends, and Eric climbing so many things. I couldn't even dream about doing that, but I can do things that me as a normal person would have perhaps seen as impossible when I was sighted.
yeah, and look, we've had conversations in the past about the employment rates for people that are blind or low vision as well. So funding your exploits, you use obviously content as the means of funding your exploits, don't you?
Yeah, largely so.
Predominantly.
So
Yeah.
I consider, because of my experience with adventures as a sighted person, I realized that it's a partnership. Everybody needs to get a benefit out of it. So whether it's building a house, whether it's doing something else, I drove a new Land Rover Defender for a stretch of about 65 kilometers through the Overberg. And it was a promotional thing for Land Rover themselves. So it gave me the opportunity to do something epic, which gave me a story to write, gave me an article, which I sold to a magazine. It gave me something to talk about on stage, which I've now shared with many corporates. And it gave Land Rover this opportunity to show that their vehicle is so versatile and so amazing that it can do, these cool projects, even with a blind person at the wheel. It's safe and secure. And everybody benefits from it. So it's not a one-way street, and that's a mistake that many people make. The most commonly asked question, the second most commonly asked question I am is how do I get sponsorship for projects? And it's really hard. You need to build up a proper portfolio of evidence to show that you can give them value in the partnership. It's not just something that's given to you. Do you want to know what the first most commonly asked question is?
Yeah, it wasn't on my question sheet, but now I do.
What gear do I need to take along for an expedition? And my
Yeah.
answer is always the same. Put all your gear in a big pile, take half the gear and twice the money.
Oh, there you go. So, I think what's been your greatest obstacle adventuring as a blind person? Like, how have you and how did you overcome that?
I was a little fat kid at school. I wasn't the most physical child. I didn't play a lot of sports and everything. And to put myself into this world where I'm amongst the top achievers, uh, people that do extreme things that are fueled by adrenaline, that was tough. So I had to learn um, how to quickly get fit and how to get strong and be resilient. Um, can I tell you about my 2020 project so that you can understand a little bit more about
Yeah,
that?
yeah, definitely, yeah.
So in 2020, which ironically is not only a year, but 2020 means perfect sight, I decided to undertake all these 2020 projects. So I had 20 challenges over 2,020 kilometers, 3 times. And for each of the 20 challenges, I was accompanied by one of 20 sighted guides, which makes for the story more than the pedal. It's actually the person you're cycling with on the tandem that makes the story so interesting. And that adventure saw me kayaking 2,020 kilometers, cycling and walking 2,020 kilometers. And all the way along the route, we undertook all these different challenges, like the cycle race, like the Land Rover drive, and things like that. And I climbed Table Mountain from sea to summit. I kayaked rivers from from source to sea. Out on the ocean, I sailed a boat. I drove a lot of interesting vehicles and rode a horse. I remember about 5 or 6 years old, I got thrown off a horse. I was petrified of horses. I didn't go within 100 meters of one until going blind, and then overcame that to the point that I rode one on the horse for on the beach for about 60 kilometers as part of that project. Um, I'm not Eric Wainamer. I'm not going to ever climb Mount Everest, and most people are not. But that doesn't mean they can't climb their own little Mount Everest, their own challenges. It doesn't mean that they can't just do something. I met a guy that was climbing quite a famous mountain here called Lion's Head, and he's short, overweight, he's of Greek descent, struggles with a lot of mental challenges. He climbed it 500 times.
Amazing.
Someone that you never would have thought could climb that mountain. I nearly died climbing that mountain. I went and joined him for one of those climbs, and it was every step, because it's very much like steps as you go up and down, was like playing 3D Tetris. I had to put my foot down 3, 4 times to find a footing. You're hanging off the edge of a cliffside in places, and for me, I was like, well, if he can do it, why the heck can't I? And that's what a lot of people say. If this blind guy can do it, if he can build a house, if he can go and sail a yacht, if he can drive a car like that, if he can go around a racetrack 22 times with 22 different vehicles, from an ice cream bicycle to an ambulance, from a horse to a Porsche, why can't I do it? I can as well. And I guess that's where it's almost become a mission to set an example, I suppose, not only for blind people, but for disabled people, and for people that are generally stuck in their way of thinking. I was a chef. I thought that's my life. I'd never change.
Yeah, incredibly well said. And I think our audience is they're coming along to these sorts of things to sort of to get a little bit of that. I is that your biggest sort of motivator at this particular point in time, or do you have stigmas associated with being blind in South Africa, trying these things? What would be your biggest motivator at this point to try these many things?
It's so sad. It's so sad, yeah, for blind people, because most of them, they'll have the support at a school for the blind, and when they qualify, very few of them get employment, and most of them end up as an asset for their family with a tin mug in hand and a guide at the traffic lights begging for money. It's very, very sad, because it really doesn't have to be that way. A blind person's a great person to employ, because they're not going to be looking for another job. They're going to be so appreciative of a good job. They're going to just dedicate and do their job.
Yeah.
It's not the blind person that's the problem. It's the society's issue with not being able to see the capabilities of a blind person. And there are blind people that are total dickheads, and there are blind people that are amazing and that are achievers. We're just normal people, like sighted people are. To get them to see that means they need to have exposure to us. They need to see that we're normal. They need to see that we can communicate as they can, and that we're able to achieve things, if be it, you know, by different means, we can still live a full, fun, fruitful life. And by setting that example, not only for the blind people, but that um, showcasing that for the sighted might open doors for other blind people. Because as I said, I'd never met one. I'd never had a conversation. I'd never ever taken the time to just stop and speak to a blind person. And hey, woe is me. I should have.
So what I want to get to the bottom of with my questioning and with previous discussions with you is you're quite a complex character. As you
Very.
said, as you said, like you don't have one particular great achievement that you defined yourself by. You haven't, as you pointed out, you're not the first person to climb Everest or the first person to, go 300 kilometers along a salt flat or something like that. But I guess when you describe your achievements, sometimes you can kind of even brush over them and go, yep, because I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. And then uh, I, I, I guess what I would like to say, uh, were you a storyteller before you were an adventurer? And which one do you place greater stock in? Because the question I often get asked with any kind of travel in general, is it, people travel to get stories and to get pictures and content, and often sometimes they don't really sit in the experience itself in that particular moment. Do you find it challenging to navigate both? Like if you had to pause doing something in order to make sure that you're getting the proper story to go along with that activity?
Yeah, so just to the first part of your question there, there's definitely many firsts that I've managed to achieve. First blind man to climb Table Mountain, first blind man up Lion's Head, first person to take a Vespa scooter through Africa. There's a lot. First blind man to go around Killarney International Racetrack once, let alone once. I went around 22 times. There's a lot of firsts, but it's not about that. For me, it's all just about creating crazy stories that I can share with audiences through the word or talks. It's really just a case of I've been addicted to adventure for as long as I can remember. I blame it on my parents for sending me to Boy Scouts, stories by, Tintin, the Famous Five, all of those things. It just had me wanting to go and explore and go and do fun things, go and have these little moments of escape from the real world, go and get lost so that I could find my way. And I guess that made me a storyteller. So I've always been the one that shares exploits and talks about things and does crazy stuff. Before I went blind, I was already that person. I've just had to find a creative way of turning it into a unique and bigger picture that's tailored now to specifically doing things as experienced through sound, smell, taste, and touch, rather than just sight. Because sight accounts for between 75 and 90% of any person's used senses. And when that's switched off, as no doubt, the other senses do feature a little bit more. You free up a lot of bandwidth to focus on those senses.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess you have to navigate as well, how do I make my content accessible and also marketable as well to everyone? That would be something that you would probably tussle
Luckily,
with a fair
the
bit.
world is Yeah, luckily the world has become a lot more of an accessible place. Where Holman didn't have an iPhone at his fingertips. He didn't have audiobooks and maps that he could find bearings, directions, locations, see and I. He didn't have all of those things. So it's certainly a lot easier to travel today than it was back then, even though there were advantages back then. The world has become accessible. Anybody, you talk about an audio book. Yes, that's great. But even a written book is accessible now to a blind person, where, a few years ago that wouldn't have been the case.
Yeah, so speaking of a few years ago, obviously, gift of hindsight that you now have, having lived both experiences of a sighted and a blind man, what advice would you have given yourself at age 20?
Yeah, it's actually the same question came up to me a few days ago, and I struggled to answer it because there's so much. Regardless of the sight loss, just as an adult talking to a young Chris, I would have said save money so that life can be easier down the line. Don't waste money in the way that you do, because we all buy flashy cars and do stupid things with our money. Um, and just as a blind person, I would have just said to myself, maybe when I rebirthed as a blind person, I'd say it's gonna be okay. No matter what it is, it will be okay. And everybody's path will be different. You choose your path, just don't let it be a dead end. Don't, if it is a dead end, turn around and find another turn. Don't just give up. Don't just stand there because then you're just going to get run over. Um, which I think I got that very quickly. I got that. If you stand there, you'll get run over. And I embraced the fact that I have to just keep moving, one foot in front of the other. They don't have to be big mountains you climb. They just have to be steps in your own home, steps on your road. Um, I also was very confused by the fact that so many of my so-called friends disappeared when I went blind. And that led me for a long time just to be angry. But then I realized, well, perhaps they're just not real friends. That doesn't mean you can't make real friends. And some of the best mates that I have today, I've met through being blind, through my projects, through my exploits, riding bikes, cycling, kayaking, people that I now hold more dearly than I did as a sighted person. And I can see through the BS now, so I can see more clearly who's if people choose me as a blind person, good. Then there's no surprises for them.
So we are getting to the point where we're wrapping up our webinar, and geez, what a webinar it's been. Chris, you've been fantastic. So thank you once again for sharing your insight and your experience and everything else that makes you you. Can I just ask a question from one of our guests here? And I've already, well, you've already answered one of the other questions that did come through. Uh, what advice do you have to somebody who's wanting to create their first story?
So many people ask me this question as well. That guy that I mentioned that's climbing Lions Head has climbed it now 500 times. He's been trying to write a book for the last 3, 4 years about it. Just start writing. Pen, paper, keyboard, just start writing. Start telling the story. Get it down on paper. You can sort it later, but get it out your head and get it on paper. And even if it's you delete 1,000 times, if you don't start and you don't move forward, it'll never happen. And the easy part, sorry to be such a grim reaper, but the easy part is writing the story. It's what you do with it thereafter, because it's writing, typesetting, the editing process, publishing, aggregating. Those are actually bigger hurdles. If you realize that the writing is just a small little summit that you have to climb in the beginning, you might do it a little bit quicker.
And once again, Chris, how can we follow you? What have you got coming up in the next 12 months? Give us some spoilers.
I've got a couple of little adventures. I'm planning to do a solo paddle, a kayak, a circumnavigation of Robben Island. So it's something I'll do with my guide dog and myself in the kayak using tech only to navigate and everyone following a couple hundred meters behind. But I'm not sure if I'll tackle that late this year or probably only next year around Easter time. And yeah, I have a new tech business that I'm about to launch, which, when you build a house like this and you have a very big mortgage that has to be paid, you have to think about those things. And you have a 5-year-old that goes to a fancy private school, you have to pay school fees. So it's time for me to also put my head down and have a little bit of a different challenge, because adventures are just challenges. So this is a tech business that I'm starting up, which I can't really talk about too much, but we're launching in the next 2 months, around the beginning of September. And hopefully it's going to shake the cage a little bit and do some good things. So watch the space. My website is Christopher Venter, which links, it's christopherventer.com, and that links back to my Facebook page. I'm on X, Instagram, wherever you find, just look for Chris Venter, Christopher Venter. And on YouTube, there's a lot of content. And as you mentioned, the Building Blind project, although it was filmed for a local documentary on a satellite channel or an international satellite channel, DSTV, we used small webisodes that made up the episodes, and they're all available on YouTube. So you can just search Building Blind. And yeah, I worked on that project with a guy called Rian Manso, who's quite possibly the most famous South African adventurer. He's cycled around Africa, he's kayaked many oceans and done all sorts of amazing things. Eric Weinemeier sort of things.
So once again, thank you so much, Chris, for sharing your story with us and sharing a bit of insight as well. You've always been a very engaging speaker, but I think what makes you really good for this sort of thing is how genuine you are in both your strengths and, you know, the things that you can also improve on as well. I think everyone kind of sits in that category of being able to analyze their own weaknesses as well as their own strengths. So once again, thank you for being so candid with us and for joining us today.
Yeah, we all put our pants on one leg at a time, and anyone who's found a way to do it without doing that, let me know, because that'd be cool.
Once again, have a great day, Chris. I'm going to end the webinar there. I hope you've all enjoyed it. As I said, it's being recorded, so we will share it for anyone that's missed it today. But once again, thank you to our guest. Thank you to our visitors that have come along and listened along and engaged with our speaker today. Hope you all have a fantastic day.